to welcome everyone to the Unitarian Church of Los Alamos. Whoever you are, wherever you are in your life's journey, whomever you love, you are welcome here. This is our adult religious education class on biblical scholarship and literacy. My name is James Carroll, and I'm glad you're here. I want to remind everyone that we have this course webpage. I've actually updated it and tried to keep it up. So there's some great information here, sites.google.com/view biblical scholarship and literacy. I encourage people to go there. It's got links to all the previous classes and some additional reading and sort of things that I'm starting to add for, with links to commentaries and online tools and things like that might help. The other thing I've added just recently is this calendar. Because we keep moving my class around, it's not consistent. I need to do it on my day off. I get every other Friday off. That means we can't do it consistently on the third Friday, and then or the third Sunday. And then this class we had problems with Thanksgiving, and so we moved it early. So because things are difficult, I know that we just created this calendar, and hopefully that'll keep people informed of what the dates are. If you use Google Calendar, you can just import this into your calendar, and it'll tell you when I'm teaching and when I'm not. And that'll help especially for the Friday classes. I want to remind everyone especially that we're having our comparative religion class this Friday. It was normally the third Friday, but it's going to be this weekend, and it's going to be on Saturday. Normally it's on a Friday because we had a conflict on Saturday. So we're scrambling to just make some time in November that we can actually do things. November and December are hard months. So it's going to be this Saturday, which is a weird time, and if you can't make it, I understand. But that's when we're going to be doing the comparative religion class, and it should be on Buddhism. Finally, and we're going to talk about Buddhism after the Buddha. We'll talk about the first Buddhist council and the second Buddhist council and the split between the Mahayana and the Theravada. So I encourage people to come to that. That should be an interesting discussion. So where were we? Let's talk. So today we're talking about Exodus again. Let me grab my text here. And where were we? Well, we talked about the 10 plagues. We talked about Moses and Pharaoh, and then we talked about the Passover, the matzah, the bitter herbs. We talked about burning the sacrifice. We talked about sacrifice of Abraham and how that compared. We talked about substitutionary sacrifice, and possibly the origins of that idea of painting your doors with blood. And we talked about some of the kind of earlier religious rituals and pagan traditions that this may have been, and cultural traditions that this may have been borrowed from. And we got ourselves to the Red Sea, and we started to part it, and then we ran out of time. And I just briefly said a few things about the parting of the Red Sea, and then we quit. So what I want to do today is just pick up where we left off, and we'll do the parting of the Red Sea right. We'll stop and slow down and do that. Then we'll do the waters of Mara, and the striking of the rock to bring forth water after that. And then we'll also talk about the manna. And we'll bring them to Mount Sinai. The Battle of the Amalekites is in there too. And so we'll try to get people to Mount Sinai today. And I keep threatening to do this class on the historicity of the Exodus story, and it keeps getting put off because things keep taking longer than I expect. If we make it to the end of Exodus, at the end of if by the end of today we make it to Mount Sinai, then next month, will be that historicity class. And if we find a way to fit that in December, so be it. If we don't, it'll be in January. So that's what we're going to try to do. Our goal is to make it to Mount Sinai today, and we'll see how far we make it. So, you remember last time we talked about this issue of the Red Sea and the Sea of Reeds, and we mentioned that in Hebrew the text is translated, if you just literally translate it, it's Sea of Reeds, the Yam Suf Reeds. But we also mentioned that the Septuagint, the Greek translation, early translates it as the Red Sea. And so that's where this tradition comes from, is that it is related to the Red Sea. But we also have this text from 1 Kings that mentions the Yom Suf. And it tells us where it is. It says that this place is where King Solomon built a series of ships that would sail on the Gulf of Aqaba and down into the Red Sea. And they say that is the Yom Suf. So if the Yom Suf referred to a different sea, a different body of water, by very early in Israel's history, the tradition was that the Yom Suf, the Sea of Reeds, or the Red Sea, was right here, the Gulf of Aqaba. How do you say that? Aqaba? Aqaba. And so that's kind of where the early Jewish tradition has, and that's why we call it Red Sea, and that's why it's translated Red Sea, although it's literally Sea of Reeds. This matters only because there are people who argue that, and there's another reason for this, the P source, and we'll talk about this, is the one that claims that the wall stood up as walls on either side and they passed through. J and E talk about wind blowing all day long until the ground is hard and they pass over. And so there's this theory that there aren't really many reeds here, and they get this theory that up in here in the marsh, there's a bunch of little lakes and stuff, and maybe a wind dried up one of the lakes and they rode across it, and then the water came back, and the chariot wheels of Pharaoh's army were bogged down in the marsh. And so that's why this whole Reed Sea matters, because it's one of the arguments that comes up around historicity, is what if the origin of this story has to do with a small marsh parting up here, and then it gets magnified into walls of water later and moved down here. But that's why that whole Yom Suf thing matters. But again, my response always is that the tradition that the Yom Suf is this body of water is very early in Israel's tradition. We can see it again from 1 Kings 9 too. Okay, so that's where this comes from. So let's start the crossing. Exodus chapter 14. And now I have already given you a few of the differences between the sources, but I'm not going to try to pry them all apart. This text, Exodus 14, is a combination of J, E, and P, all munched together. And I'm not going to try to separate them all. That would be very tedious and would take us all day. We're just going to read the story kind of as it sits. We're only going to mention the main differences, that E and P have this kind of wind blowing all day, and P, or J and E, have the wind blowing on. P has the water splitting immediately. The other major difference is that according to J and E, Moses does all the miracles, but then God parts the water, all the plagues except for this, and then God just parts the water. In P, Aaron does all the miracles, and Moses parts the water. So both of them preserve this tradition that there's this change of the operator, but they disagree on who that are. Those are the main disagreements between the different sources in this text. So let's read it as we've got it. And I'm not going to read all of it, there's no time, but I'm going to read a few of the key verses. Verse 12, the Israelites wander to the Red Sea. They find themselves trapped. They can't go forward, and they find the Egyptians behind them, and they make the following comment. Is this not the very thing we told you in Egypt? Let us alone. Let us serve the Egyptians, for it would have been better for us to have served the Egyptians than to die in the wilderness. So this is our theme of the Israelites complaining. And we'll have that over and over and over again. We'll have complaining Israelites. And Moses said to the people, do not be afraid, stand firm, and see the deliverance that the Lord will accomplish for you today. For the Egyptians whom you see today, you shall never see again. The Lord will fight for you. You have only to keep still. So this is the phrase, the theme of the Lord as a warrior fighting for the people that we will see over and over again in this particular passage. That whole keep still is sometimes interpreted just be still and know that I am God, but in the context it seems more like Moses saying, stop complaining. All you need to do is stop complaining and God will save you. So then what happens? Verse 18, the Egyptians shall know that I am the Lord, and I have gained glory for myself, Pharaoh, his chariots, and his chariot drivers. Verse 19, the messenger, angel, or presence. I mean, it depends on how you translate that. It's the messenger, the angel, the presence of God, something like that, who is going before the Israelite army. How? In a pillar. Remember, there was this pillar of fire by night and a pillar of cloud by day. So we're going to talk about the pillar for a minute. But the God who was in the pillar moved and went behind them, and the pillar of cloud moved from in front of them and took its place behind them. You remember that very dramatic scene in the Prince of Egypt where the pillar of fire burned behind the Israelites and stopped the Egyptians? And it says, then Moses stretched out his hand over the sea, and Yahweh drove the sea back by a strong east wind all night and turned the sea into dry land, and the waters were divided. This is a switch of source right in the middle of the text. Let me read it without the, and then it says, then the Israelites went into the sea on dry ground. Let me read them in the two halves. So it says, Moses stretched out his hand over the sea, and the sea was divided, and the waters were divided. Sorry, that's how it goes. So he stretched out his hand, and the waters were divided, and there's an interjection. The interjection reads, the Lord drove back the sea by a strong east wind all night, and turned the sea into dry land, and the water and the sea and the waters were divided. So you've got this break in the middle. So again, that's the it's either J or E, we can't tell. In the J-E story, the wind blows all night, and the land gets dry enough for them to walk on. And then P is on either end of that, where Moses stretched out his hand, interjection, poof, the waters are divided. Okay, so yeah, go ahead, David.
How do
I don't know how they do all of this, but there are key words in it that help. And you get a complete story when you chop these pieces out, and you have to take that interjection. And also, the other problem is there's parts we know are P earlier, and then they need that interjection for the P source to make sense.
Okay.
When you take it. But again, the details here, I'm not the expert. I'm just kind of quoting what I've been told. Probably not. The linguistic evidence is probably not sufficient because it is so short. So again, I've got a commentary behind me that has a chapter on source criticism for this text, and they go through word by word, verse by verse, and tell you why they assign it to different sources. And if you want, after, we'll sit down and go through that verse, because I'm not sure how they do it. I read his conclusion and skipped his evidence because I was in a hurry this morning. All right, so let's see. Verse. So now we've parted the sea. Let's go back. Let's talk about this pillar thing. What is the meaning of the pillar? Well, we have lots of evidence for what the pillar is about. We have texts from, well, here we go. I'm going to just read this. In its bellicose aspect, God's fiery cloudy conveyance also recalls stereotype depictions of the Canaanite storm god, among whose epitaphs at Ugarit is Rakab Art. I don't know actually how you say any of that. Cloud rider. And that's from the Exodus 1-18 commentary by William H.C. Prop. There's also passages where it says, and God rides upon the clouds. And we also have New Testament passages where it says, and Jesus will come with the clouds of heaven. All of those things are tied together to this idea that Yahweh is a storm god who rides upon the clouds. But he's also a burning, fiery presence, so you get this fiery presence in the cloud. When it gets dark, it provides light, and then when it gets light, it looks like a cloud of smoke. And that idea that God's presence is depicted by the smoke is carried forward into the temple. And so in front of the veil in the temple, there is an altar of incense. And on these rituals where they would cross into the Holy of Holies, they would sprinkle incense on that altar. And then on the Day of Atonement, the priest would actually take a portable censer in with him and create a cloud of smoke between him and God's presence. And so this comes back to the age-old question we asked last time. Which came first, the ritual or the story? And the answer, of course, is we do not know. They feed each other, but they are interwoven in this part of the text. The ritual of the altar of incense explains the need for the cloud and for God's presence in the cloud, and the other way around. The myth of God's presence in the cloud explains the use of the altar of incense in the temple. It's to recreate that cloudy moment of God's presence. There's also a Mount Sinai thing going on here, and we'll come back to that in a bit. Okay, so now we part the water. And then in verse 23, it says, the Egyptians pursued and went into the sea after them, and all of Pharaoh's horses, chariots, and chariot drivers. And at the morning watch, the Lord, in the pillar of fire and cloud, looked down upon the Egyptian army and threw the Egyptian army into panic, and he clogged their chariot wheels. This is where that other theory, right, that the earlier version of the story just was that their wheels got clogged. So anyway, he clogged their chariot wheels so that they turned with difficulty, and the Egyptians said, let us flee from the Israelites, for the Lord is fighting for them against Egypt. This is again that theme of the Lord is fighting for Israel. The Lord is warrior. We'll come back to that. Then Yahweh said to Moses, stretch out your hand over the sea, that the water may come back upon the Egyptians, upon their chariots and their chariot drivers. So Moses stretched out his hand over the sea, and at dawn the sea returned to its normal depth. And the Egyptians fled before it, and the Lord tossed the Egyptians into the sea, and the waters returned and covered the chariots and the chariot drivers. Verse 29, but the Israelites walked on dry ground through the sea, and the waters forming a wall for them on their right and on their left. Okay, so this is one of the stories of divine violence, and we have covered this theme before, but we have to at least mention it in case people are joining us for the first time. And what do we do with this theme of divine violence? If you're a believer in God, if you don't believe, then this isn't as much of a problem. The text is just violent and you move on. But if you're a believer, I want to offer at least one option, and that is that this is a depiction of the beliefs of the people who wrote the text. It's not a movie of what actually happened. Right? So we don't have to believe that all this happened just the way the text describes. All we are dealing with is people of faith who are expressing their view in a tribalistic society of how God's greatness is manifest and how God's glory is shown. And in this case, what they're saying is, we know our God is great and worthy of worship because he protects us, even to the point of slaying our enemies. And that's a very common sort of ancient Near Eastern worldview. If you're dealing with a society that's constantly attacked, constantly at war from its neighbors, etc., you want a God who will protect you and fight your battles for you. And so that's how they see God's greatness. It doesn't have to be an accurate depiction of who God really is, and it doesn't have to be a movie of what actually happened. And this is kind of the liberal believer approach that is common and promoted by people like Pete Enns, Jared Bias, etc., those sorts of people who, and I guess I should have had a list of their books you can read if you're interested in that perspective. If you are a non-believer, you have a very similar view of what just happened. This is an accurate statement of faith within a tribalistic, warlike society that was constantly at war, and this is how they viewed their God's greatness and worthy of worship, etc. All right, so, let's see. Let's talk about the mythical elements, though. Beyond just the violent aspect of destroying the Egyptians, again, and I guess I should have also mentioned, it's also seen as tit for tat for the drowning of the Israelite children earlier in the story, right? So we drown the Egyptians because of the Israelite drownings. But if we want to also look at the story isn't just a story of God defeating Israel's enemies. It has mythical overtones and theological implications that harken back to the earlier religious traditions of the day, including, for example, the Enuma Elish, which tells the story of Marduk slaying a serpent, a sea serpent, Tiamat. This is the storm god. We constantly have the storm god, who, by the way, would ride upon the clouds. This all fits. Yahweh is the storm god, who slays the serpent, and from the serpent builds the world. And from her blood creates the springs that spring up that let us drink. That's what the springs are. They're the blood of Tiamat and the rivers and all that flow from her blood. And then the storm god causes rain to fall upon the earth so that the earth is watered and brings forth fertility. And so this warrior motif of God as warrior slaying the sea serpent, the ocean, in this case Tiamat, is common. It also shows up in Babylonian theology. But it also shows up in Egyptian mythology. So, for example, let's see, I got to find my mouse. Okay. So, for example, this is Nut, spelled here for you if you care about the Egyptian. This is Shu, the god, and this is Geb. Nut is the sky goddess. In Egypt, everything is backwards. The sky is female. She's actually the mother who bears us, and we go back to the mother in death. They believed in actually going up into heaven. And instead of having the heavenly, or the realm of the dead underground, the realm of the dead was in the sky. And so for them, the sky was a goddess. And the earth, Geb, was the ground. Between them was Shu, the wind, the air, the atmosphere. And Shu's job is to hold the waters above apart from the waters beneath so that the dry land can appear and there can be room for life. Because if he fails in his duty to hold up the sky, she will crash down and life will cease. This is exactly the creation motif we see in Genesis chapter 1. It says, a wind from God, a ruach, spirit of God, brooded upon or blew across the waters. That's how the creation starts. And then in chapter 3, the waters above are divided from the waters beneath, and the dry land appears. So in this account, P talks about the waters dividing. Only instead of above from below, it's the right to the left. And what happens? The dry land appears. That's day 3 of creation. So this story harkens back to these mythical elements of creation rather intentionally. It's also what happened during the flood. Except during the flood, the waters above and the dome that kept them apart, it failed. It's like Shu stopped holding up the sky, and the waters above crashed down, and there was a flood. And the waters below come up, both. And again, that's like the blood of the serpent. We'll talk about that because it'll be important later. This whole thing has to do with their view of birth. Right? The firmament is like the placenta that keeps the waters above from the waters below. And the world is not created so much as born. All this matters for the theology here, and I talked about this when we talked about the flood, that it was a rebirth of the world. In this case, this is the national birth of the nation of Israel. And so passing through the waters is like their rebirth as the nation of Israel, which has implications for how later Christian interpreters will interpret the text. So let's go through the Christian analogy, and then I'll do the song. I'm changing my order on the fly. I apologize. Notice in 2 Corinthians, this is Paul speaking. Therefore, if anyone is in Christ, he is a new creation. The old is gone and the new has come. So for Paul, there is a connection between redemption and creation. The act of being redeemed is an act of new creation. And so the redemption motif and verbiage used in the Exodus story, where God redeems Israel, is connected to the rebirth of Israel in Jewish tradition, and Paul borrows that and brings it into Christian tradition, which of course is manifest in the Christian rite of baptism, where Jesus comes down into the water. When he comes up, a dove descends, and he calls it the Holy Ghost, the Holy Spirit, which is ruach again, if it were in Hebrew, which is that wind. Wind and spirit are the same thing. This is the wind that brooded upon the waters. To drive the point home, the Synoptic Gospels all describe Christ calming the sea. This is the God, the thunder God, who has the power to slay Tiamat, to calm the seas and bring order from that chaos. Again, that's the creation motif. And it's showing us that Jesus is the creator God of the Old Testament by borrowing the same mythic theme we just saw in Exodus. And of course, they really drive it home by letting him walk upon the water without sinking, etc. So let's go back and let's do the Song of the Sea, or the Song of Moses, or the Song of Miriam, alternately, depends on how you describe it. This is Exodus 15. Now this matters because we're talking about the sources for the parting of the Red Sea, etc. And there are 4, J, E, P, and we described how they were mixed together in Exodus 14. And then we have the Song of the Sea. And it's actually a 4th source, quoted by one of the earlier texts. It's hard to say who is quoting it, but one of the earlier texts quotes this source, and then the redactor drops it in whole. And so what we really have here is a completely new source. And it's woven together by, after they cross the Red Sea, there's Exodus 14 is a text discussion in prose of the crossing of the Red Sea, and then they drop this line in 15:1. Then Moses and the Israelites sang this song to Yahweh, and then up comes the song. The passage that says, then they sang this song, is anachronistic. The song was not sung then. How do we know? Well, because it mentions, in the past tense, future events. Events that haven't happened in the story yet, like going to Mount Sinai and going to Israel and passing through the nations and the nations being afraid. All those things are still in the future. So the song mentions the Exodus, and it mentions these other things. And the author wanted to get it in because apparently people knew this song. It was a song they probably sang. And he wanted to get it in as an extra source, so he put it in the text. And he put it right here because he wanted it to be a source for the Exodus, which it is. But you can tell that it's an older song, right? It doesn't quite belong where it was put. That being said, it is probably the oldest source for this story we have. And we know that from the Hebrew. If you look at the Hebrew, and the analogy that people keep using around me that I keep hearing, so I'm going to repeat it, is there's a difference between Shakespearean English and Valley Girl English. And if you heard the two spoken, you could put them in their proper time period. And, if you heard someone say, man, that's bad, you probably knew that was from the 80s, right? It's that sort of thing. You can just kind of date these stories from the type of Hebrew they use. And we can fake it. But if you tried to fake Shakespearean English, you would probably get it wrong. You could tell that it's being faked. And so there is some debate about whether this is Old Hebrew being faked. But songs are the most likely to preserve ancient traditions. I can probably sing a whole series of Beatles songs and unfortunately Michael Jackson songs. They're just in my head. U2 songs. I can just quote them all, right? And those things are preserved naturally. Because this is probably a song that people sang to their kids until in fact its Hebrew was old, outdated, and then it was written down. So this song probably preserves a very old, very ancient, possibly early monarchic, maybe even older tradition of what the Exodus was like. In fact, one person went so far as to say it could have been written down or sung within a generation of the people who experienced the event. I think that's pushing it. But it's old. And so, let's see how it says. And I'm going to read it. Go ahead, David.
Let me just point out, we still sing.
So it's
every service.
It's
not the whole thing, but a central piece of it.
okay. I didn't know that. So it's still part of the Jewish service.
Who is like thee among gods and Lord.
Okay, that's a fascinating verse to have sung because it preserves. I'm going to talk about that first. Anyway. Okay, so let's go. Verse 15. I will sing, and I'm going to put Yahweh for Lord because this. If you've read any Canaanite sort of praise songs to their gods, this sounds really familiar. This song fits right in with kind of the sort of thing we see. So I'm going to put Yahweh in everywhere and we'll read it. So it says, I will sing to Yahweh, for he has triumphed gloriously. Horse and rider he has thrown into the sea. Yahweh is my strength and my might, and he has become my salvation. This is my God, and I will praise him, my father's God, and I will exalt him. Yahweh is a warrior. Yahweh is his name. Pharaoh's chariots and his army he cast into the sea. He picked officers were sunk in the Red Sea. The floods covered them. They went down to the depths like a stone. I'm going to read the whole thing. This is good stuff. Your right hand, O Yahweh, glorious in power. Your right hand, Yahweh, shattered the enemy. In the greatness of your majesty, you overthrew your adversaries. You sent them out, your fury, and it consumed them like stubble. You notice again, it's the warrior motif. God is the warrior destroying the enemies in the sea. And at the blast of your nostrils, the waters piled up. Nostrils and wind are often connected. In fact, in Egypt, we get this phrase, given life, given breath, wind to your nose. Because as long as you're alive, there's this wind in your nose. It's the symbol of spirit in Egyptian mythology. So this fits right in. The blast of your nostrils, the waters piled up. The floods stood up in a heap. The depths congealed in the heart of the sea. The enemy said, I will pursue, I will overtake, and I will divide the spoil. My desire shall have its fill in them, and I will draw my sword, and my hand shall destroy them. But you blew with your wind, and the sea covered them, and they sank like lead in the mighty waters. Who is like you, O Yahweh, among the gods? Who is like you, majestic in holiness, awesome in splendor, doing wonders? Again, this is the part that David just said they still use in Jewish synagogue today. I didn't know that. This one is really fascinating because, again, this is old stuff, and it preserves the older Jewish tradition of monolatry rather than monotheism. Right? It's the belief in many gods, but the belief that Yahweh is the greatest of the gods, the king of the gods, like Baal or Marduk, ruling in the heavens among the gods. And why does they rule? Because they are the mighty warrior who slew Tiamat, slew the sea, / created the world, / rescued their people. All of that gives them the right to rule, you see. Let's see. Verse 12, you stretched out your right hand and the earth swallowed them. In your steadfast love you led the people whom you redeemed. You guided them by your strength to your holy abode. Notice now we're still past tense, but we're talking about things that haven't happened in the story yet, which is what tells us that this song is kind of chronologically out of place. The peoples heard, they trembled. The pang seized the inhabitants of Philistia. The chiefs of Edom were dismayed. Trembling seized the leaders of Moab, and all the inhabitants of Canaan melted away. This is propaganda stuff. This is if you're living in a place where your nation is constantly under threat of attack from its neighbors, this is a great way to say, don't attack us, because if you do, you'll drown in the depths of the sea like the Egyptians before us, because our God fights for us. So this is propaganda to try to convince the other nations, not to mess with Israel. Terror and dread fell upon them, the might of your arm, they became still as stone, until your people, O Yahweh, passed by, until the people whom you acquired passed by. And then comes the interesting bit at the end. You brought them in and planted them on the mountain of your own possession, the place, O Lord, that you made your abode, the sanctuary, O Yahweh, where your hands have established. Yahweh will reign forever and ever. That's all king motif, and it either refers to Mount Sinai or it refers to the Jerusalem temple, which again leads to another question. The two are very similar. They all have the same themes and motifs in them. But the place where Yahweh will reign forever is in Jerusalem, not in Mount Sinai, because Yahweh packs up and leaves with the Israelites and goes with them to Mount Sinai through the temple. So we have to ask the question again, which came first? Did the story tell us about Mount Sinai as if it was a temple in Jerusalem? Let me think how to say this. Is the temple in Jerusalem built like Mount Sinai on purpose because of this story? Or is this story told the way it is in order to draw the temple back in time, the temple that already existed, back in time to Mount Sinai. And again, we do not know, but the connection between Mount Sinai and the temple is strong, and we'll come back to it in a bit. So this story, this song, talks about the parting of the Red Sea, the passage to Mount Sinai, and then the passage through the nations, where they were all afraid of the Israelites, to the Promised Land, and then they settle in the Promised Land. And there God establishes his abode in the temple in Jerusalem. And so some people have proposed that the text is older than the monarchical period, and yet it has this reigning from the temple, which is a monarchical reference. Some people have claimed that last bit was then tacked on later. So if you wanted to make it really old, pre-monarchical, you say the early part's pre-monarchical and then this part was tacked on. If you think it's a little later, like I do, then maybe it's early monarchical and you see the themes of the monarchy in the text. So it's either early monarchical, in my opinion, or just pre-monarchical. Okay, and when the people, that's verse 20, then the prophet, now this is interesting, prophet Miriam, Aaron's sister, it just called a woman a prophet. I think that should be significant and we should pay attention to it. That's not the sort of thing we see in kind of some of these later traditions that have grown out of this, including Christian traditions, but it's hard to argue that the text has a more exalted opinion of women's position than is sometimes appreciated. So the prophet Miriam, Aaron's sister, took a tambourine in her hand, and all the women went out after her with tambourines and dancing. And Miriam sang to them, "Sing to Yahweh, for he has triumphed gloriously. Horse and rider he has thrown into the sea." That's the opening lines of the song. In other words, she sang the whole song, and the author gave us the opening lines and then didn't repeat it. If you remember Prince of Egypt, do you remember after they pass through the sea, she comes out with the tambourine and starts shaking, and all the women start singing? That's this passage from the text. All right. You'll notice how many times they mention Yahweh as a warrior, very explicitly. This is a tie back to the Baal theology and to the Marduk theology of Mesopotamia and the slaying of the sea and turning Yahweh into a warrior. So the oldest text we have depicts Yahweh as a storm god, as a warrior. It mentions him by name, Yahweh. It says that he delivered the Israelites, and that's why he's worthy of worship. He made the other nations afraid, and it makes no mention of Israel. It doesn't say who was saved. This is important for next month's class. It doesn't say who was saved. It doesn't say who was involved in the Exodus. It doesn't mention numbers. It doesn't say there were loads of people. It doesn't mention manna. It doesn't mention all the other miracles. It doesn't mention any. It just says Yahweh took them through the part of the Red Sea, brought them out of Egypt, and brought them to the Promised Land, and doesn't even say who they are, which maybe is significant, maybe not. We'll talk about that next time. So, David knows where I'm going with that, but
Well, no, actually, I know, right? I want to hear it, right? I'm eager to hear it. But one thing to mention right at this point is Miriam's name. Okay, one etymology I see for it, and it might be the only one, is it actually comes from Maria, bitter sea.
okay.
And this connection with the sea seems to be right there in her name, which is.
If that's true, then it's really fascinating that verse 22 drops us into the next story, which is bitter waters being made sweet. By the way, Christians have also made a big deal about this once in a while because Mary's name is probably bitter, Mari.
Mary, so the assumption, I think, is that her name was Mary.
Yeah.
Yeah, they just get changed into Mary in somewhere between from Greek and Latin.
Okay? So the waters of Mara, again, bitterness, Mari. This is the same root going on here. And this is the story that immediately follows the text. And the source is unknown. It's not clear whether it's J or E. And I think we don't even know if it's P. We're not sure who wrote this one. It's a short story, and there's not enough evidence to decide who's the origin of this source. But what's the story? It says they came, verse 23, when they came to Mara, they could not drink the water, Mara, because it was bitter. This is why it was called Mara. So they're mentioning a place named bitter because it had bitter waters, probably meaning salty waters they couldn't drink. So the people complained. Why did you bring us out of Egypt to let us die? This is the refrain, right? They said it when the Egyptians came. Now they're going to say it again. Why did you take us out of Egypt? We were happy there. At least we didn't die of thirst. Now we're out in the wilderness. We're going to die of thirst. We can't drink this water. And so God says, I will fix it. Moses, take a stick, a branch, a tree, something like this, throw it into the waters, and I'll make them sweet. And then he does so, and then they drink the water. So this is the first of the miraculous water stories after the parting. So if you go all the way back to the theological, kind of cosmological implications, creation happens when you, first thing you have to do is create the dry land, right? And that's what happened in the parting of the Red Sea. But then you have to irrigate it. And so all these creation stories start with that creating of the dry land. Then they start with irrigating, providing springs and rivers and stuff, usually out of the blood of Tiamat. And so here we have Yahweh depicted as a healer, which is important. In, for example, Egypt. Egypt had its healing goddess, Isis. You would go to her for healing. Here, Yahweh was already the warrior. Now he's the healer. So he has power both to destroy and to part and to turn the desert into a fertile place and make bitter waters sweet. And so he does so by throwing a stick into the pool. Of course, you can imagine the Christian drawings of this. He's throwing a cross in. That's the tree that gets thrown in, and it's Jesus' sacrifice on the cross that turns the bitter sweet. Either way, this is the first of our many water stories. Interjected after that is a bread story, and then we'll come back to another water story. And this is the manna from heaven. This is primarily pea, but it has other chunks mixed in. So this is Exodus 16. And again, I don't have time to read all this, but I'll tell you that the gist of the story, it starts as you would expect. Verse 3, the Israelites said to them, if only we had died by the hand of Yahweh in the land of Egypt, when we sat by the flesh pots and ate our fill of bread. For you have brought us out here in this wilderness to kill us wholly, and the assembly with hunger. So first it was water, now it's we're starving to death. And so Yahweh gets mad at them, and Moses gets mad at them, and they yell at each other for a minute. And then it says, well, in the evening, so that you'll know it was the Lord who brought you out of the land of Egypt, I'll do this miracle. And two miracles happen. The first is, in the evening, quail came up and covered the camp. And in the morning, there was a layer of dew around the camp. And when the layer of dew lifted, there on the surface of the wilderness was a fine, flaky substance as fine as flake on the ground. As fine as frost on the ground. And when the Israelites saw it, they said to one another, Manna, what is it? Because they didn't know what it was. And then they ate it, and they don't starve to death. And there's this whole thing about gathering an omer of it every day, but not 2 on the Sabbath, but you can't gather enough that it is left over, because if you do, it goes rotten. And there's all sorts of sermons about that, right? That you have to spiritually rely on the Lord every day. You can't gather extra. You have to do it. But on the Sabbath, you rest. And you can imagine all the sermons that get drawn from this. 2 things about the quail and then the manna. The first is that this is a natural phenomenon that is known to happen in the Sinai sort of desert region. Quail migrate, and as they migrate over the sea and over the desert, depending which direction they're going, sometimes they get weak and they fall to the ground and have to rest, and you can walk up and pick them up and eat them. And so this is a natural phenomenon that is well known, which again doesn't really answer our historicity question. It just raises an interesting dilemma that can go either way. Was the story based on something that really happened? There were some people wandering through the desert, and quail landed at their feet, and they ate them and ascribed that to Yahweh as a miracle. Or did a real miracle happen? Maybe it was. Or, alternatively, did the author know about this event and used it as his miracle under the idea that what's really miraculous about it are the numbers. There's enough quail to feed million. The story actually has 2 million people involved. It tells us how many males are there. If you put women and children in, you end up with a number of about 2 million, which is logistically impossible. But is the miracle just how many quail landed right when they needed them? And remember, he says, so you know it's the Lord. I'm telling you it's going to happen tonight. And sure enough, it happens tonight. So is that the miracle, that a natural phenomenon happened in a certain large numbers at the time predicted by Moses? So again, either way, this is a natural phenomenon that we know does happen in the Sinai. We also know that, and this is almost, again, as certain, it's a little more shaky, but almost certain, that the manna is probably a reference to this honeydew stuff, which is these aphids, eat these plants, and this actually also happens in the Sinai, especially under terebinth trees. And so this is probably something that real wanderers in the desert would have eaten to make their passage. There isn't enough to feed 2 million people. So again, the miracle isn't that that some sort of a dew appeared, it was the amount of it. And then, of course, its description isn't quite right for this dew, although we still think that's what it probably was. But it's not a flaky, bready sort of thing that you can bake. It's more this liquid. But again, it matches this idea of dew on the plant. In the morning, the dew was on the plant leaves, these little droplets of water, but you could eat it. And so this is almost certainly what they're referring to. And again, we find it's a sort of natural phenomenon that really happened. The miracle is the amount and the timing and all this other stuff. There is one more verse that is relevant, and it's going to sound like a really boring verse, but it's really significant. It's verse 36. An omer is 1/10 of an ephah. Why is that significant? Well, again, it has a hint about where these stories come from and what their nature is. Apparently, there was a tradition that they gathered an omer a day per person. An omer is a unit of measure. Why is that interesting? Well, because whoever was writing this story knew that his audience didn't know what an omer was. But the tradition had come to him that it was an omer. So he had to explain what the omer was to his audience, the author of the text. And so he tells them an omer is 1/10 of an ephah. Ephah is something that shows up all over the place in the Old Testament as a well-known unit of measure. But omer appears only here. So what that tells us is twofold. It tells us that the story is based on a tradition that is older than the time at which it was written. That's the first thing it tells us. And the second thing it tells us is that whoever is writing it lived much later than when the story took place. It's based on an authentic, in the sense it's much older. There's an older tradition he's basing. He's not making it up. It's someone else before him made it up, and he's relaying it to us. But whoever told the story first, it was a long time before the person who is writing down the text that we have in front of us. Again, this is very important because it tells us something about the nature of the text we're reading. We're not reading Moses' account of this event. Moses wouldn't need to tell us what an omer was. We're writing an account that is many years later, that is based on a tradition that was handed to that author that was many years before. And so, again, that's very important, I think, for the kind of the historicity of the text. It tells us what kind of text we're dealing with. All right. There's a couple other things that are happening here. This idea of this food from heaven is related to, again, the temple worship. First of all, the manna is gathered, and it's one of the relics that are placed within the Ark of the Covenant as a perpetual memorial forever of what God did to them by feeding them in the wilderness. So if you'd opened the Ark of the Covenant, what you would have found inside was the bottle of this manna, among other things and other relics. And we also have this table of showbread. The water and the bread that is produced for them in the wilderness becomes this kind of ritualized thing. And then they present this bread in an offering table to the Lord, but it is baked bread, unleavened bread. So the connection here is that the unleavened bread that they brought with them from Egypt is replaced by the manna until they make it to the promised land, when the manna ceases and they again celebrate the Passover with unleavened bread. It's unleavened bread, manna, back to unleavened bread, and then they put unleavened bread on the temple in the table of showbread before the Lord. This is, of course, brought out in the Christian allegories that are based on this story. When the Gospels say, all four of them, that Jesus fed multitudes, they're putting him in the role of Yahweh in the Exodus, who fed the multitudes with manna. But Jesus says in all these accounts that he's actually feeding them with what he calls the bread of life, which brings us to John 6, which if we had time we would read all of John 6 because it's really important for this stuff. But John 6 is the bread of life sermon where Jesus says, my flesh is flesh indeed, and he's comparing himself to the quail, the matzah, the unleavened bread, and the manna. And he says, those things are all representations of my flesh, which you must eat and drink my blood, because these are the spiritual offerings I've given to you. They're symbols of the spiritual truth I'm giving, not just these physical objects that were given to the Israelites. So again, the story of the Exodus is important for understanding what is happening in the New Testament. In the New Testament, when Jesus feeds the multitudes, he's not just feeding people. He's proving that he is the God Yahweh, or has the power of the God Yahweh, either way, to feed the multitudes, because that's what Yahweh did during the Exodus. All right. Last one, water from the rock. This story is either it's E, with maybe some bits from J. And it's in Exodus 17. And here we have our second miraculous water story. And it says, the people thirsted for water, verse 3, and the people complained against Moses, said, why did you bring us out of it? You get the point. Verse 6, and I will be standing there in front of you on the rock at Horeb. Strike the rock, and this is God speaking to Moses. Strike the rock, and water will come out of it, so the people may drink. And Moses did so in the sight of all the elders of Israel. He called the place Massah and Meribah, because the Israelites there quarreled and tested the Lord. That's to quarrel and to test. Saying, is the Lord among us or not? That phrase, is the Lord among us or not, shows up in 1 Corinthians. So I think we'll probably should go back to that verse at a later date. But I want to point out before we go on that there is an alternate account of this in Numbers chapter 20. And then there is a reference to it in 1 Corinthians chapter 4. Let's talk about Numbers 20, and then I'll come back to Corinthians 4. Numbers 20 has a whole other account of this same story, and it has many similarities, and we're not going to read Numbers 20 because we just read this one and it's very similar. But the same place, geography, the desert of Sinai or Sin, and it's called Meribah, which means quarreling in Hebrew, and there the Israelites quarrel with Moses about the lack of water, asking why. So the text says it's at the same place. And God provided instructions for Moses and Numbers to go to him in prayer, and the result, water miraculously comes out of a rock by the power of God through Moses striking the rock and quenches the people's thirst. They're almost identical stories. But one happens before Mount Sinai on the way in. The other happens after Mount Sinai on the way out. And the differences. God's command to Moses in Exodus is to strike the rock. And in Numbers, it is to speak to the rock. And the involvement of Aaron is only recorded in the Numbers account. And God's judgment of Moses and Aaron's actions is, in Exodus, it's implicitly affirmed by God. You did a good thing. But in Numbers, God says Moses and Aaron didn't trust him and did not honor him as right, holy in the sight of the Lord, and thus they are prevented from entering the promised land. So Moses doesn't get to lead the people into the promised land because of this event. So what's happening? And I think the answer is the first account is E, and the second account is P. And the redactor has put one before and the other after, making a nice symmetry. But really what we're dealing with is two different traditions. In one, Moses is supposed to hit the rock and strike it. In the other, he's not supposed to and gets in trouble for doing it. But both of them remember this story of Moses striking the rock. One just thinks it was a good idea, the other thinks it was a bad idea. This is, again, another evidence of these alternate sources because we have another doubling. In both cases, though, there are mythical images again. So this is a theme I hope you've noticed, that we keep telling these stories and talking about the mythical images involved in them. In both cases, there's a creation-cultivation theme. Again, I talked about that. First, God creates the world by dividing the waters, and the dry land appears. Then God has to create springs, wells, sources of water. There's also this concept of the staff and life. Moses hits it with the staff. This is a phallic image. And what's happening is in everywhere but Egypt, the earth is female. In Egypt, they're backwards. But normally the earth is female because when it rains, that's the semen coming down from heaven, and you plow the earth to create a furrow, and you plant the seeds in the earth, and the rain comes down from heaven, waters it, and plants grow. So the sky is masculine, and the earth is feminine. To strike the earth with a rod has to do with the masculine striking the feminine and then creating a source of life, water, etc. We also have the staff that is used as the staff that turned into a serpent. So it reminds one of Marduk striking Tiamat and then out of her blood making these rivers and wells, etc. But I can't help but also be reminded of what we call water witching today, or the people who search for water with a staff. And the staff tells them, dowsing it's called, where to dig for water. So it's like the staff guides these people to where they're going to dig, then they find the right spot, they strike it with the staff, and then the people dig there and they find water. So this sounds to me like a water search / tradition that is common all over the world in ancient religious traditions as well. So I think that's probably what's going on here. But there are also these mythical images and temple images, just as There's in every one of these stories it's connected to the temple. If we tell the story the way E does, because by interjecting these other sources, P, we actually kind of confuse the timeline. If we just look at E's timeline, what happens is the people are at this place where we're going to have a battle with the Amalekites, right? And there they complain and say, we want water. Moses goes on ahead, where? To Mount Sinai. There he strikes the water and makes the rock and makes water. And the Israelites then are traveling to Mount Sinai to get their drink when they are attacked from behind by the Amalekites. So we'll cover the Amalekite war in just a minute. They're attacked from behind by the Amalekites. Moses sends Joshua back to save the Israelites from this battle, and they have a battle, and then the Israelites come on forward to Mount Sinai, where they then get their drink and enter into a covenant with God. So in kind of E's telling of the story, the chronology is fairly clear, and it makes a whole lot of sense. And in the text we have in front of us, there are other things put in the middle that kind of confuse the chronology. So that means that the stone with the water flowing out of it is actually on the foot of Mount Sinai, at least in one of these texts. And so here we have, this is my friend Michael Lyons' drawing of Mount Sinai that he made for me. We sat down together and we drew this together and we had a lot of fun. But you notice the cloud? You recognize the cloud. You know where that comes from. And here we have God's throne and the Ten Commandments, and here we have the Ark of the Covenant, where the Ten Commandments and the pot of manna are kept. We have the burning bush. We have the candelabra. We have the table of showbread, which represents the matzah and the manna. And then we have the rock with the water, and we have the laver with the water, and then we have the altar, and the altar here where they offer sacrifice and make their covenant to God. So the tabernacle is an attempt to take the temple with them. Tabernacle is an attempt to take Mount Sinai with them as they go. Or Mount Sinai is a story told to mirror the temple intentionally. There's a lot of parallels. In this case, the parallel we care about is the water. The divine gift of water, and the theme of waters flowing from the mountain is one as old as time, etc. So, we're very close to the end. What happens? Again, he makes the water, and they're attacked from behind by the Amalekites, and we have this great war with the Amalekites, which again is an E story, in chapter 17, verse 8 through 16. Amalek came and fought with Israel, and Moses said to Joshua, choose some men and go out and fight with Amalek. Now, this is interesting. Joshua is the one that goes back to fight. This is our introduction to Joshua, really. And it's going to be important when we get to Canaan and we have the conquest. Joshua is someone you can trust. Joshua was there with Moses. Joshua's already fought battles before he fights the Battle of Jericho and won. And he won at Moses' direction. And so Joshua is Moses' logical successor as the war chief. So he sends Joshua back. So really one of the points of this story is to introduce Joshua and get us acclimated to him as a warlord / leader of armies. And so Joshua did as Moses told him, and he fought with Amalek. And Moses says, I'll go up to the top of the hill with the staff of God in my hand. And then he says, whenever he keeps the staff raised, they win. And whenever he lowers his hands, they start to lose. But he gets tired. So Aaron and Hur, this other guy, go up and they put him on a rock. Again, we have a reference to the rock, related maybe to the rock that we are striking in the other verses. We put him on the rock and they hold up his hands so that the battle is won. And the text forces us to reinterpret the meaning of the hands throughout the text. In one place, it references a banner, a war banner. And so Moses' staff is the war banner calling Israel to fight, and that's why they win when the banner is raised. But then later it says Moses is entreating Yahweh to protect the people. It's almost like his hands are raised in prayer and supplication. And we know in other places when this is the position of prayer. You raise your hands to supplicate God in prayer. So it turns from the war standard to supplication of Yahweh, and then it ends with a covenant, where God covenants that Amalek is cursed forever, and you're going to fight them forever, and they're going to be your enemy forever. And the covenant is made by raising the hand. And so the hand then turns into a covenant. So the meaning of the raising of the hands is reinterpreted as the text moves through the story from war standard to supplication to covenant. And the covenant is specifically of genocide, to destroy the Amalekites forever because of this event where they attacked Israel cowardly from behind while they were going to get water. And so, who are the Amalekites? We don't know. We don't have archaeological evidence of their existence. They show up later in the story as an enemy that David and Saul fight. There's all sorts of battles with the Amalekites based on David and Saul, and there's a command here to kill them all utterly because of their actions here in the text. But as far as we know don't know who they are, and so we're left with several options. There could be a mythical, people brought into the story, or they could be an actual people somebody fought during an actual exodus, or they could be a later group that Israel did fight in David and Solomon's time that was then injected back into the story as a way of introducing Joshua and introducing the traditional enemies of Israel. And we do not know. It'd be really nice to find an extra biblical reference to them. And as far as I know, we don't have any. All right. So that gives us our war with Amalek. The other thing to kind of point out is Baal is often depicted as with a staff raised in his hand, and that's almost his thunderbolt, and that's the war standard. So if Moses is up on Mount Sinai with his hands raised while the battle is happening down below as the people come there to get their drink, again, this puts it all at Mount Sinai, these events, the e-text chronology. That makes sense because Baal stands upon the top of his mountain throwing thunderbolts down with his raised bolt, and you get this Canaanite god of war image through the whole story that I find just fascinating. Okay. Jethro's advice, which we can do in about 2 minutes. If we're headed to Midian, it does not surprising. Jethro shows up. He's a Midianite high priest after all. And the importance of this story is just that it grounds us in where Sinai is. Mount Sinai is in Midian, not where it's traditionally located at the south of the Sinai Delta. It's over in Midian, and it tells us that Midian is involved. So what happens when he shows up? Well, Jethro shows up, and Moses is excited to see him, and he tells him all about the great miracles that have happened, and he just kind of wows Jethro. Jethro says, wow, Yahweh is better than all the gods. That's wonderful. And then Moses sits down to judge the people, and the people come with him like, he stole my cat. No, he stole my cat. And they're, Moses is having to sort out these court cases that the people are bringing to him, and he does it all day and all night, and he gets tired, and he can't handle it, and he can't sleep, and there's no time for anything else. And Jethro says, look, Moses, this is dumb. Pick out a bunch of people over hundreds and over 50s and have judges and let them judge the people. And if they have a hard case, they'll bring it to you. But if it's an easy case, they can handle it. And so, again, what is the significance of that? There are people who will give sermons about how this is related to church order and governance and whatever. But the real significance is it places Israel's system of judges in the mouth of a foreigner who sets up the system, and Moses agrees that this is a good idea, and it comes from Jethro. And we've already talked about Yahweh's name himself coming from the Midianites, and here we have a tradition that Israel's governing structure, political structure, also comes from Midian. That Midian is, according to this text, the source of much of Israel's tradition. Their religion, their God, the name of their God, and their judicial structure all come from Midian. While Moses is in Midian, that's when he sees the burning bush and meets Yahweh and finds out his name is Yahweh. It's there after he married the high priest of a Midianite high priest's daughter. And we know from the Egyptian text that Yahweh's name first shows up outside the Bible in a reference to the wanderers of the desert where Midian is, and they worship Yahweh according to this Egyptian text. So the Israelites, there's a tradition that the Israelite religion came from Midian. Their structure came from Midian, and that's where they meet Yahweh, is in Midian. Again, we'll come back to this. Yes, David.
One thing here. Another thing that's interesting about the Jethro narrative is you can argue on that basis that the office of rabbi precedes the office of priest. Because a rabbi is a teacher, but also a judge. So the judges are the office of judge, which is sometimes the office of rabbi, precedes the creation of the office of priest, which is done by the revelation of Sinai.
That's an interesting sort of tradition. Now,
I don't know if that's a tradition in Judaism, but that just leapt out of me.
So Moses, Jethro is already a priest. He's the Midianite high priest, but we don't have Israelite priests yet. But we do have Israelite judges. Yeah. And so the judges precede the priests, in Israel at least, according to this story. Which brings us to Mount Sinai. And this is the traditional spot for Mount Sinai. It's St. Catherine's Monastery. It's probably not where Mount Sinai is. St. Catherine's Monastery is down here somewhere, and I've been there. It's a really beautiful, nice, striking mountain. But Mount Sinai is probably over here somewhere. because this is where Midian is. And of course, if they're crossing this sea, you've got to get them over here from Mount Sinai. And again, this is where Midian is. This is, if you cross this sea, then you end up over here. And so now we are at Mount Sinai. What does that mean? Well, I want to tell one more kind of parable. We've said many times that this story is kind of the most told or retold throughout Jewish, Muslim, Christian, and even Mormon traditions. This story is told and retold, and it's told as a parable over and over and over again. Egypt is like slavery to sin and the fall. Paul makes this analogy. So you travel through the waters of baptism and the trials of life to Mount Sinai. Now I put Mount Sinai in the traditional spot, but that crosses this sea and then you get the trials. Probably they cross this sea and the trial. Anyway, but Mount Sinai. And then you wander in the wilderness. That's the trials of life. But during the trials of life, you're guided by a pillar of fire, and you're fed by God with bread and water, and he takes care of you during your trials. And if you overcome your trials, eventually you get to enter the promised land, which is like heaven. And you cross the river Jordan, which is like the veil, and you enter the promised land. This is an analogy that's explicit in Christian theology, and it's explicit in frankly, Mormon theology in the Book of Mormon. We've got passages that refer to this. And in fact, the entire story of Nephi is a retelling of the Exodus story, complete with the murmuring and the crossing of the waters and the whole bit. And so it's almost like biblical fan fiction. The point is, this story is influential from Judaism to Christianity to Islam and all the way into modern new traditions like Mormonism. This is a key story that is meant as an allegory for how we live our lives. Why did the Jews murmur all the time? Well, because we constantly murmur. So we need that reminder. Okay, now that we've got ourselves to Mount Sinai, the story will change dramatically. Because from now on, we're going to start talking about law and ritual. We'll start talking about what the temple should look like, how to build the temple, how it works. And we'll move from this kind of law into this theme of the story, into the theme of narrative and ritual and law. But already we've seen the development of Israel as a nation. When they show up at Mount Sinai, they get an army, right? How did that play out? Did you follow it, right? They show up to Mount Sinai, and they got an army. They fought a battle. They got leaders, and they set up their judicial system, and now they're going to get their laws. And when all those things are in place, then they're ready to go into the promised land. So we made it to Mount Sinai. I said, if we made it, next time we'll do historicity. Next time we'll have a class before we dive into the laws, and we'll just talk about whether any of this stuff happened, why we think it may have, why we think it may not have. And, no spoiler, but we don't know. But we're going to give the hints that we have and the evidence we have one way or the other so that you can see where the debates come from. We'll talk about the pieces we know didn't happen and the pieces we think might have and why. So I hope to see you then. After we do that, we'll dive into the laws and the Ten Commandments and the temple and the tabernacle and all that stuff that comes in the rest of Exodus and the rest of Leviticus, frankly, is all about that. Before then, we finally go into the promised land in Numbers and Deuteronomy. So I'll see you next time. Thank you for coming, and appreciate it.